Hi everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about the discourse and construction of gender on TV, and specifically I'm going to be using the shows Sex and the City, Episode 1, and You, Episode 1. And my main argument is that Sex and the City portrays femininity through the gaze and traditional and social expectations, while You focuses on the consequences of toxic masculinity, showing us what happens when men follow restrictive gender roles. And together, these shows demonstrate how television teaches us what it means to do gender, because as our lecture states, gender is not something you are, it is something you do. And I'll be using the documentary Tough Guys 2 and the article on gender and media representations. So the first episode of Sex and the City centers on women navigating dating life, sex, and identity in New York, but it still performs femininity inside the boundaries of the gaze. From our femininity lecture, we learned that men look at women and women watch themselves being looked at. And this is exactly what happens in Sex and the City. The camera lingers on the women's bodies, outfits, and attractiveness. Their femininity is performed through fashion, makeup, and desirability, all a part of their gender expression. So even though the show is about women, the camera still positions them as objects to be viewed. Not to mention, the article Gender and Media Representation explains that the media repeatedly portrays women in sexualized ways, and often they are depicted in terms of their appearance and aesthetics, unlike men. And this aligns perfectly with the entire premise of the show and its portrayal of femininity. Even though the women are successful and career-driven, they still follow beauty ideals and they prioritize dating and being attractive to men. So, although the show gives women more narrative control and sexual agency, it still reinforces beauty norms, the male gaze, and the idea that women's value is linked to desirability. All in all, while the show appears progressive for the late 90s, early 2000s, its portrayal of women still operates inside a male-defined structure of femininity. So it's not a good show for the way we think about women. Now, let's talk about You, which is all about toxic masculinity. In the first episode, we see that Joe embodies all four of Kimmel's rules of masculinity. Don't be a sissy. Joe doesn't show vulnerability or weakness. Be a big wheel. Joe positions himself as someone that's smarter than others, powerful and dominant. Be a sturdy oak. Joe is calm, reliable, and emotionless. And give him hell. Joe stalks Beck, and he's aggressive and uses violence, even going as far as murdering Beck's ex. And these rules were also shown in Tough Guys 2, where Jackson Katz explained that masculinity is a performance or a guise designed to hide vulnerability. And from Joe's internal monologue, we learn that everything he does is because he wants to be in control. Moreover, from the masculinity lecture, we learn that masculinity on TV is tied to violence, rivalry, and aggression, and these traits are learned, not innate. So Joe's behavior isn't natural. It's a learned script for how men are supposed to act. His stalking gets framed as him being observant, his violence gets framed as him being protective, and his aggression gets excused as love. And these ideas show how masculinity becomes dangerous when paired with emotional suppression and domination. Finally, our lectures talked about the male emotional suppression cycle, where boys grow into men who cannot express fear, vulnerability, or sadness, leading to anger, isolation, and violence. And Joe ultimately represents the adulthood stage of this cycle, as he appears calm, but all these feelings he's bottled up come out in toxic ways, stalking people, manipulating them, and eventually murdering them. So all in all, I would say this show is bad for the way we think about men in our society. It focuses on toxic masculinity, and it tries to romanticize it. Not to mention, it also centers heavily on violence and highlights how harmful the cultural script of masculinity can be. So, how do these two shows construct gender differently? Other than the fact that they're set in New York City, Sex and the City constructs femininity primarily through the male gaze and white beauty standards, thinness, fashion, desirability, and dating norms. And it shows femininity as a social expectation and often for male attention. Meanwhile, You constructs masculinity as power, control, violence, and emotional suppression and entitlement. And it highlights the dangers of consequences of restrictive gender expectations men are taught to follow. As such, both shows illustrate that gender is something we do, but the results look very different. To conclude, these shows reveal how TV shapes gender norms differently across femininity and masculinity. Sex and the City shows how femininity is performed under the pressure of the male gaze and aesthetic expectations, while You demonstrates violent consequences of masculinity built on emotional suppression and dominance. Ultimately, we've learned that television doesn't just reflect gender, it constructs it, and whether that construction helps or harms depends on how we engage with it. And here are my references. Thank you.